The sun was hanging low over the ridge when I first saw her, a lone figure down in the dry riverbed, barefoot and still as stone. My horse shifted under me, but she didn't move, not even to shield her eyes from the glare. Her dress was torn and clinging, her hair damp and tangled, and her knees pressed into the white dust like she'd been there for hours. She looked up just once, her voice steady as if she'd rehearsed it for days. "Don't shoot, Cowboy. Let me live, and I'll give you a family." I kept my rifle ready, but my hands didn't tighten. There was no fear in her face, only the kind of calm that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been in a moment where one decision could change the rest of your life. My name's Grady Holt. I was born in a wagon camp somewhere along the Santa Fe Trail. My mother a seamstress and my father a mule driver who hauled freight between army posts. We settled in Arizona territory when I was 12 on a patch of land that gave just enough grass for cattle and just enough soil for corn if the summer storms came on time. Work was the way of life out there. Sunrise meant chores, and sunset meant rest, only if the day's list was done. My folks taught me that a man's worth was in how he kept his word, helped his neighbor, and bowed his head on the Sabbath, no matter how hard the week had been. After the war, I came back to find the land thinner, the railroads pushing their way west, and men with deep pockets buying whole valleys just to fence them off. My wife Ellen and I tried to hold our place together. We lived lean mending instead of buying trading eggs for sugar at the trading post and making every dollar stretch until it frayed. But lean was still enough when you had someone to share it with. That ended, the summer fever came through. In the same week, I buried Ellen and our infant boy on the rise behind the house under a stone with no names carved. Folks offered to help, but I turned them away. I didn't want condolences. I wanted quiet. 6 years passed like that, just me, the land, and the sound of wind in the yucca. I went to town twice a season for salt pork flour, and tools kept my eyes down and spoke only when it was necessary. My world had shrunk to the boundaries of my fence line, and I thought I'd let it stay that way. But that day on the ridge, with the sun burning the back of my neck, I saw her kneeling in that old riverbed, and something in me paused. The trail behind her was empty, no riders in sight, yet she didn't look like someone lost. She looked like someone waiting. I shifted in the saddle, my fingers brushing the lever of the Winchester, and for the first time in years, I wasn't certain whether to turn away or ride down. Then from far off a sound carried over the basin, faint at first, but drawing closer. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate. I wasn't sure yet if they were meant for me or for her. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the dry hush of the basin and the faint creak of saddle leather beneath me. She stayed kneeling in that riverbed, her eyes down as if she had no reason to move. I eased my horse down the slope, keeping my rifle low but ready. Dust lifted at each step, curling around her shoulders before settling back into the white earth. When I stopped 15 feet from her, she raised her head just enough to meet my eyes. Her face was worn from sun and wind, the skin roughened and marked by a thin scar that traced along her cheek. The fabric of her dress was torn at the shoulder, clinging in damp patches, the dirt on her bare feet caked and split. I asked where her people were. She gave no answer, only sat still with her palms resting open on her knees. I swung down from the saddle, my boots crunching in the grit, and stepped closer. From this distance, I could see the swelling under her left eye and the deep cracks in her lips. She didn't lean away when I draped my old wool blanket over her shoulders, but her hands tightened at the edges, like someone guarding a last possession. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said. She didn't nod or thank me. She simply held the blanket tighter, her gaze fixed on me as though she were measuring something I couldn't name. I told her my name. After a pause, she gave hers Suma. She tried to stand when I asked if she could walk, but her knees buckled almost at once. I caught her at the waist. Her skin was fever warm. She let her weight rest against me for only a second before straightening. Without another word, I lifted her onto my horse and mounted behind her, turning toward the narrow trail that led home. The ride back was quiet, except for the creak of leather and the low groan of wind across the canyon. The land around us was bone dry, scattered with brittle yucca and fence posts grayed by sun. When we reached the homestead, just 2 rooms, a lean-to barn and a half-dug well, I helped her down. She leaned on the porch rail until I opened the door. Inside was plain a table and 2 chairs, a cot, a stove, and a bucket of stale water near the door. She stepped in without asking, her eyes scanning the space, showing neither surprise nor disappointment. I pointed her toward a chair, filled a tin cup from the bucket, and set it before her. She drank it all before glancing toward the small strip of bread cooling near the stove. "You run from someone?" I asked. She gave a slow nod. "They think you betrayed them." Another nod. "Did you know?" she said at last. The word came steady. She told me how her brother had led a raid on a settler ranch, only for the plan to be spoiled when someone warned the ranchers. The blame fell on her. A white trader had followed her to the river weeks earlier, speaking as if she owed him something. She refused. He told the others a different story. "They tied me outside the camp," she said. "No water, no food. Said I brought shame. I walked away after 2 nights. She thought she'd been walking 3, maybe 4 days. I looked at her hands, blistered, scratched, and bleeding in places, and said nothing. I told her she could wash up out back. There was half a bucket of water near the trough. "I'll stay inside," I said. She studied me for a moment before standing and moving to the door with the blanket still over her shoulders. I busied myself stacking wood near the stove. But every sound from the yard reached my ears, the slosh of water, the soft gasp when it touched her raw skin. When she came back in, her wet hair hung down her back, her skin clean of the dust that had dulled it. She carried the smell of wind and earth now instead of sweat and heat. I laid a thin mattress and folded blanket near the fireplace and pointed her to it. She sat knees drawn under the blanket without speaking. The night passed in the kind of silence I'd grown used to, thick, patient, except for the faint shift of her breathing. Before dawn, I opened the front door to let in the cool air and found her already awake, watching me from her place by the hearth. I told her there was coffee, that we'd fry eggs later. She rose stiffly, legs trembling, as she crossed to the table. Over coffee, I asked why she had said that thing in the riverbed about giving me a family. She looked at me without blinking. "Because if I begged, you might have turned away. If I offered something, maybe you'd listen." She said men often looked at her as if she were something to buy. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood and broke the eggs into the skillet. By noon, she was mending one of my shirts on the porch, her feet tucked under her. The blanket was tied around her waist now, the tear at her shoulder still showing skin. She didn't glance up when I passed, only tracked me with her eyes when I was near. That night, she asked to sleep in the barn. I brought her a blanket, a lantern, and a bucket of water, then stepped back so she could close the door. Back inside, I thought of Ellen and the headstone on the rise behind the house. 6 years alone had taught me the shape of quiet. But now, another set of footsteps moved across my boards. Another breath shared the air. I didn't know if she would stay, but she was here tonight. The next morning, wind rattled the clothesline and sent a fine dust across the yard. I found her on the porch, sewing another shirt, her hair combed through with her fingers. She accepted the coffee I brought without looking at me, our fingers brushing just slightly. When I asked if she'd slept, she nodded and said there'd been no thunder. I didn't ask what it meant. Later, she came out to the back pasture carrying nails and a hammer, crouching beside the post I was setting. "You don't have to help," I told her. "I know," she said. "You're not earning your place here." "I know that too," she replied. Then she added, "If I do nothing, I start thinking. And when I think too long, I go back to places I don't want to remember. By afternoon, the smell of beans with onion drifted from the stove. She moved slowly about the kitchen, bare feet on the boards. At one point, she stopped and asked how long my wife had been gone. 6 years, I told her. Fever took her and the baby. She said nothing more, only turned back to her work. That night, she laid her blanket near the hearth again. When I asked if she planned on leaving, she said no. "There's no one out there that wants me back," she added. I told her if anyone came, I'd know it, and I didn't let what was mine be taken. She didn't look away, but the question of what she was to me hung in the space between us. By the 4th morning, she moved through the house like she'd learned its shape, sweeping floors, washing linen, watering the small plot behind the barn. She'd repaired her dress, though the tear at the neckline still opened when she bent forward. I told myself it wasn't about wanting, but about noticing the presence of someone warm in a house that had gone cold. That evening, we sat on the porch as the stars came out. She asked why I never went to town more than twice a season. I said there wasn't much there for me anymore. She rested her chin on her knees and told me I looked at her when she wasn't looking. Before I could answer, she stood and stepped closer, her bare feet brushing my boot. She rested her hand on my knee, steady, and watched my face. I placed my hand over her wrist, slow and certain. She asked me to kiss her. I told her I wasn't a man who did things halfway. She said she wasn't asking halfway. When our lips met, it was unhurried, steady, real. And as the wind moved over the land, I knew something had shifted, though I couldn't yet see where it would lead. The morning after that first kiss, the house felt different. I rose before the sun and found her blanket folded neat by the hearth, the fire's coals cold. She was already outside, kneeling in the small patch of earth behind the barn where she'd been clearing ground the past few days. Dew clung to her hair and darkened the fabric at her back. She worked without looking up, her fingers pressing seeds into the soil one by one. I leaned against the door frame and watched a moment before walking down the steps. She glanced over when I asked if she was always up before dawn. "My mother used to say the day starts before your eyes open," she answered. I crouched beside her and asked if she'd ever had a place of her own. She shook her head, pressing the dirt over the last row. "Never stayed anywhere long enough," she said. We worked side by side through the morning, hauling brush from the yard, splitting kindling, fixing the hinge on the barn door. She moved like someone used to, relying on herself, steady and deliberate, not waiting to be told what needed doing. When we stopped to rest, we sat on the porch steps, sharing boiled potatoes and salted pork. She peeled hers with her fingers, blowing on it between bites. After a long quiet, she asked when I'd last been touched by someone. I told her the truth, not since before my boy got sick. 6 years, I said. She held my eyes and said I touched her carefully. I asked why that mattered. "Because you don't flinch now," she replied. There was no need for more words after that. Late in the day, while I was checking fence posts near the North Ridge, I heard the faint rhythm of hoofbeats from beyond the trees. It wasn't the main trail, the sound came from rougher ground. I straightened and listened. The beats grew clearer, deliberate, not the wandering path of a lone traveler. By the time I stepped into the yard, Suma was on the porch, drying her hands on a cloth. Her gaze followed mine toward the slope. "How many would come for you?" I asked. She hesitated. "Maybe 3, maybe 5. Depends on who sent them." I asked if they'd be white. One of them, at least. "He's the one who lied," she said. She told me he'd either want proof she was dead or take her for himself. I told her she'd sleep inside that night and lock the door. She answered, "It became my fight when I walked away alone. I didn't argue. Instead, we checked the yard together. I made sure the rifle was clean, loaded both pistols, and set the shotgun within reach." She kept close her eyes, scanning the fence line as if she'd been doing it all her life. As dusk fell, the hoofbeats returned closer now. We stepped out onto the porch, and waited. A single rider broke from the trees, a man in a worn vest, his hat shadowing a scar down his cheek. He stopped 30 yards out, rifle resting on his saddle horn. "You lost?" I called. He tipped his hat back and said his name was Clive Remick, that he was tracking someone, an Apache woman traveling alone. Claimed there was a bounty on her, said she'd been involved in settler deaths. I didn't move my rifle. "You think she'd be out here?" I asked. He said people went where they thought no one would find them, but his kind always did. Suma stepped forward, her voice carrying steady across the yard. "I didn't kill anyone," she said. Remick's eyes shifted to her, a slow smile touching his face. I cut him off. "She's on my land. That makes her my concern." He asked if I was hiding her. I told him I wasn't hiding anything, but he wasn't taking her. His smile thinned. "You got no authority to block a bounty," he said. I told him I didn't recognize bounties from men who'd run a woman off a cliff for a few dollars. That quieted him for a moment, but he warned she was worth more than I thought, and I was alone. "I've got enough bullets," I said. His horse sidestepped, restless. My rifle didn't waver. "You want me, take me," Suma said suddenly. "Don't make him fight for me." "No," I told her, still watching Remick. "You don't give yourself to filth like this." I leveled the rifle. "One more step, and I'll drop you where you sit." Remick studied us both, then pulled back on the reins. "Ain't worth the mess tonight," he said. "But I'll be back, and I won't come alone." We watched him ride off until the sound faded into the hills. Suma's grip tightened on the pistol she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," I told her. "You'd fight for me?" she asked. "I already am." The crickets had started again by the time we went inside, but the air felt heavier than before. We didn't speak much that night. She laid her blanket on the floor this time, closer to where I sat by the window, with the rifle across my knees. We both knew the quiet wouldn't last, and that whatever was coming would test the choice we'd made to stand together. The evening after Remick's visit, the air felt heavier, as though the wind itself was holding its breath. We ate in silence, listening for anything beyond the low crackle of the fire. Suma kept the pistol close at hand. I stayed near the window, eyes shifting between the yard and the dark line of the ridge. Neither of us slept early. Near midnight, she spoke from her place on the floor. "Do you still believe I can give you a family?" I looked down at her, the lamplight catching the edges of her face. I thought about the room behind me, the one I'd closed off 6 years ago, and the cradle that had stayed empty since. "I think you already started to," I said. She didn't answer, only reached a hand toward my boot, letting it rest there. By dawn, we were moving. I showed her the low spots in the fence line where a man could slip through unseen, and the blind corner behind the barn where the ground stayed soft enough to hide tracks. She listened without interrupting, asking only once if I thought they'd come soon. "Could be today," I said. "Could be next week." She took that in without a change in her expression. When we stopped by the barn, she turned to me. "If something happens to me, don't let them bury me nameless," she said. I told her I didn't want to think like that. "You have to," she replied, her voice steady. I finally nodded. By mid-morning, a dust plume rose on the north trail. I stepped onto the porch with the Winchester in hand. Suma joined me, pistol at her side. Remick rode in again, 3 men trailing behind 2, on mules, 1 on a buckskin stallion. They stopped just outside the yard, rifles visible. "I told you I'd be back," Remick called. His tone carried more bite than before. He said the woman wasn't mine, that the bounty was real, and that we should let her go to avoid trouble. Suma stepped closer beside me. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. One of the men muttered in Spanish, another spat and cocked his rifle. I kept my aim steady. "I bury men right here when they push me," I told them. Remek smirked, asking if I really wanted to die for an Apache woman. My eyes didn't leave his. "She's not yours to take," I said. The shot came from the left dirt, splintering near my boots. I fired once, the sound cracking through the still air, and the shooter dropped from his saddle. The other two scattered for cover. Suma's pistol barked once, driving one back behind a stump. Remek rolled from his horse, crawling toward the trees. Then it went quiet, except for the animals' restless shifting. Remek's voice came from cover. "You made your choice, Holt. This isn't over." Moments later, they pulled back, the sound of their retreat fading over the ridge. Suma's grip was tight on her pistol when I stepped to her side. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded, though her breathing was quick. We carried the dead man just past the fence line and buried him without a stone. The work was done in silence. That evening, we sat on the porch, the light fading into the hills. I took her hand. "You still want to stay?" I asked. "This is the first place I fought to keep," she said. I told her she wouldn't have to fight alone anymore. She didn't speak after that, but her fingers stayed laced with mine, until the stars came out. The next 2 days passed without riders, though neither of us believed it was finished. I checked the ridge each morning with the scope. She kept the pistol under her pillow at night. In the afternoons, she worked the garden, and I saw a quiet satisfaction in her face when the first shoots began to push through. One evening, she came to the doorway with a folded shirt. "You tore this in the fight," she said. "I stitched it." I took it from her, thanking her. "You keep things even when they're worn," she added. "I don't throw away what still carries purpose," I told her. That night, she crossed the room barefoot and slipped beneath the blanket beside me without a word. She took my hand and placed it over her stomach. "I think I'm pregnant," she said. I searched her face. "You sure?" "No," she said, "but I feel different." I told her I'd already stayed and I would stay for this too. "No more unnamed graves," I said. She pressed her face against my chest, her arm around me, and we lay like that until morning. At first light, I found her at the stove shawl over her shoulders, the smell of coffee in the air. She turned and caught me watching her. I stepped forward and kissed her. "Marry me," I said. "No preacher, no paper, just your word." She smiled faintly. "I'll stay," she said. We spent that day mending the fence line and patching the barn roof, not for the fight we knew could come, but for the life that was settling in around us. And though the hills stayed quiet, the ridge still held its shadows, waiting for the day they'd spill over. By late spring, the air had taken on a softer weight. The hard bite of winter mornings was gone, replaced by a warm breeze that carried the scent of cottonwood bark and the faint sweetness of wildflowers blooming near the creek bed. Behind the barn, Suma's garden had begun to show rows of green beans, climbing the rough wire fence, shoots thickening in the soil where she had once knelt alone with her hands in the dirt. Her belly was rounding under her dresses now. She walked more slowly, often with one hand at her back, though she still tried to keep up with the day's work. I stayed close without hovering, checking the trails each morning, mending what needed fixing, keeping the fire steady so the house never fell into a chill. When her ankles swelled, I built a small footrest for the porch. On nights she couldn't sleep, I boiled mint leaves in a tin pot until the steam filled the room. It was near midnight when she first gripped the edge of the bed and told me the time had come. I lit the lantern, stoked the stove, and brought in water from the well. There was no midwife in reach, no one but the two of us in that small room. The hours that followed were long and hard. She didn't cry out, only bit down on a folded strip of cloth, her brow damp, her jaw tight as she pushed through each wave of pain. When the baby's cry finally came sharp and sure, I just stood still for a moment. Then I moved, cutting the cord with a steady hand and wrapping her in one of my softest old shirts before laying her against Suma's chest. "A girl," I said. Suma looked down her fingers, tracing the tiny curve of the child's face, then up at me. I didn't think I'd live this long, she whispered. I leaned close until my forehead touched hers. Neither did I. We named her Elena, a name that could be spoken without shame, a name that would never be left off a stone. 3 days later, I took a plank of pine, carved her name into it, and fixed it to the front gate with iron nails. It stood level, catching the morning light. Remick never came back. Whether he'd lost interest or met an end somewhere else, we didn't know. The ridge stayed quiet through the summer. In time, I stopped checking it each day, and Suma no longer flinched at the sound of horses on the wind. The pistol went back into the cupboard. We built a cradle together. In the evenings, she chose the shape, I did the cutting. It rocked smooth and sat beside our bed, where Elena slept easy often, with one small hand wrapped around her mother's hair or my thumb. Some nights, after the work was done and the sun had dropped behind the ridge, we'd sit on the porch. Suma's head resting on my shoulder, the baby asleep on her chest, chickens pecking in the yard, and the slow wind moving through the grass. One such evening, the sky had turned deep gold at the horizon when she spoke. "You never told me why you stopped living after they died," she said. I kept my eyes on the far hills, because everything felt like pretending after that. I told her, even breathing. She shifted Elena in her arms and looked up at me. And now I turned toward her. Now it feels like starting again. Her gaze softened. "I used to think love was something you had to prove, beg for, or survive for," she said. And now I asked. She smiled faintly. "Now I think it's something you stay for, even when it's quiet, even when it's hard." I took her hand gently. "You staying?" Her answer came without pause. "I'm already home." The porch boards creaked under us as we sat there, the first stars showing over the ridge. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The sound of Elena's steady breathing between us felt like the surest thing I'd known in years. Somewhere beyond the dark line of hills, the world kept turning rough and wide as ever. But here under this roof, it was enough. By midsummer, the land had gone gold under the sun. The creek ran shallow, its banks lined with tall grass swaying in the hot wind. Work moved slower in the heat, but there was still enough to keep me from thinking too long about the quiet. Suma kept to the garden and the baby, though she still found her way to small chores when Elena slept. Most mornings I saddled the horse and rode the fence line. It had become habit more than caution, though my eyes still searched the ridge. One morning I found a post split near the north boundary. The break looked clean, like it had been struck by more than weather. I marked it in my mind and kept riding, but a restlessness settled in. Back at the house, Suma was sitting on the porch with Elena in her lap, humming low while she shelled beans into a pan. She glanced up when I stopped at the steps. "Fence is down," she asked. "One post," I said. "Could be nothing." She studied me for a moment longer, then returned to her work. That evening, after the baby was down, I walked the yard alone. The air had cooled and the horizon was smudged with the first hints of night. I paused at the edge of the barn, listening. Somewhere far off, a single horse moved. Slow, not the hurried pace of a man passing through. I stayed there until the sound faded, then went back inside. The days that followed stayed quiet, but the feeling didn't leave. On the third morning, I rode to the trading post for salt and lamp oil. The man behind the counter, Cal Turner, asked if I'd had visitors lately. There was talk in town, he said, keeping his voice low. A few riders passing through, asking after a woman fitting Suma's description. He didn't say more, and I didn't press him. When I returned, Suma was hanging linen on the line. I told her what Cal had said. She didn't flinch. "It was only a matter of time," she replied. We moved through the rest of the day without speaking much, but the air between us was heavier than the summer heat. That night, after Elena was asleep, Suma sat by the table mending one of my shirts. I cleaned the Winchester at the other end. At one point, she looked up. "If they come, I don't want you out there alone," she said. I nodded once. If they come, we do it together. The next afternoon, clouds gathered in the west, thick and slow-moving. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. I set the saddle on its stand inside the barn, checked the shotgun by the door, and stacked extra wood near the stove. Suma moved the cradle closer to the hearth. Toward dusk, as we sat on the porch, I caught sight of a lone figure on the far trail. Too far to make out the face, but the posture in the saddle was familiar, easy in the seat like a man who knew the land. The rider stopped just before the trail dipped out of view. Stayed there a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Neither of us spoke. The boards under our feet creaked in the settling heat, and somewhere near the barn, the wind banged a loose shutter. I could feel her watching me, waiting for what I'd say next. But I kept my eyes on the darkening ridge. The next morning came still and gray, the sky low with a thin mist that dampened the ground. I saddled my bay mare before sunrise, the leather cold in my hands. Suma stayed on the porch holding Elena against her shoulder, her gaze fixed on the trail toward the ridge. I rode north, keeping to the line where the open grass met the scattered pines. The fence post I'd marked before still leaned the brake untouched. About a quarter-mile farther on, I found fresh tracks, 3 horses shod moving at a slow walk. They came from the west and cut across my land before disappearing into the low draw. I followed for a time, stopping where the ground dropped toward the creek. In the soft mud near the water's edge, I saw it, an old boot print with a notch in the heel. I'd seen that mark once before, years back, worn by a man named Caleb Rusk, who'd ridden with an outlaw band that raided settlements south of here. By the time I returned, the sun was up, burning the mist away. Suma met me halfway to the barn. I told her about the tracks and the boot print. Her face stayed calm, but her grip on Elena tightened. "Then it won't be long," she said quietly. We spent the day preparing. I checked every latch and hinge on the barn doors, set the rifle near the kitchen window, and kept the shotgun within reach. Suma ground coffee and baked bread as if it were any other day, though I noticed she set aside a bundle of food and water near the cradle. Late afternoon brought a wind from the west, carrying the smell of wood smoke. I stepped out to the porch, scanning the horizon. 3 riders appeared on the far ridge, their shapes small against the sky. They didn't come closer, just sat there watching. After a minute, they turned and vanished behind the rise. Night came slow. We lit the lamp early and kept the curtains drawn. Elena fussed once, and Suma rocked her until she settled. I took the first watch, sitting near the front door with the Winchester across my knees. Every so often I stepped outside, letting the night air clear my head. It was near midnight when I heard the steady thud of hooves on hard ground. Not rushing, just moving with purpose. A single rider this time. The shape came into view under the moonlight, and I saw it was a man I didn't recognize. He reined in short of the porch, keeping to the shadows. "Grady Holt," he called. His voice was low but carried. "I'm here," I answered, keeping my tone even. He shifted in the saddle. "Word is, you've got something that belongs to others. I'm here to tell you, they'll be coming for it soon. You'd do best to hand it over." I didn't reply right away. The only sound was the horse's breathing and the faint creak of leather. Finally, I said, "You can tell whoever sent you that they'll find nothing here worth their trouble." The man studied me for a moment, then touched his hat and turned his horse. He rode back into the dark without another word. When I stepped inside, Suma was standing just beyond the doorway. She didn't ask what was said. We both knew enough. By dawn, the air had gone still again, but the feeling had changed. It was no longer a question of if they'd come, it was when. The day they came was clear and cold. The kind of morning when the air feels thin and every sound carries. I was already on the porch when the first rider appeared, followed by two more. They came at an easy lope, not trying to hide, but not rushing either. Suma stepped out with Elena in her arms. I told her to stay inside, and she did without a word. I stood at the top of the steps, the Winchester resting easy in my hands. When the riders stopped in the yard, I saw the man in front wore the same notched boot I'd tracked by the creek. Caleb Rusk. He looked me over, then nodded toward the house. "We've come for what's ours." "You've come for what was never yours," I said. My voice was steady, though my heart thudded in my chest. The moment stretched, the wind stirring dry grass along the fence. Then Caleb's hand twitched toward his revolver. I brought the Winchester up smooth and level. Behind him, one of his men shifted in the saddle, ready to back him. It ended before it began. A shout came from the ridge, Sheriff Albee with two deputies' rifles raised. They'd been watching since before sunup, waiting for the move. Caleb froze, then slowly lifted his hands from his lap. The deputies took their guns and marched them toward town. When the dust settled, the yard felt different, lighter, like a weight had lifted. I set the rifle down and went inside. Suma was rocking Elena, the baby's tiny fingers curled in her hair. She looked up, and I nodded. It was over. In the days that followed, neighbors came by, some bringing bread, others just sitting a while. Word of what happened spread quick, and folks treated Suma and Elena as if they'd always belonged here. The sheriff told me Caleb and his men would face the circuit judge next month. I had no doubt justice would be served. One evening I stood by the corral watching the sun drop behind the hills. The air smelled of pine smoke and fresh earth. Suma came to stand beside me, Elena bundled against the chill. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. The quiet said enough. Out here, life never stayed easy for long, but I'd learned something worth holding on to. You stand your ground for the people who count on you, and you don't turn away from what's right, no matter the cost. If this story has meant something to you, I reckon you might think on it a while. And if you've got a tale of your own, don't be shy about sharing it. Stories keep the truth alive long after the dust has settled.